At 5:45 in the morning on April 17, 1994, a 19-year-old man woke to the sound of a smoke alarm and discovered his sister-in-law stabbed 27 times in her bedroom, 4 months pregnant, her unborn child gone with her. Within hours, he would be arrested for her murder. He would spend the next 11 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, while the real killer, someone the family had trusted, someone who had stood beside them at their wedding, walked free for 3 decades. What investigators eventually discovered would expose one of the most disturbing betrayals in Florida criminal history. And it would take a technology that didn't even exist in 1994 to finally bring the truth to light. Mayport, Florida, is a small coastal community built around Naval Station Mayport. In 1994, it was home to hundreds of young military families. Jeremy Heins was a Navy sailor stationed there, serving aboard the USS Leyte Gulf. In November 1993, he married 20-year-old Tina Sue Livernash from Wisconsin Rapids in a simple courthouse ceremony. Michael Shane Ziegler stood as a witness. Ziegler was Jeremy's close friend, a fellow sailor who served on the same ship. The two men were inseparable. Tina moved into a small apartment in the Heron Point complex with Jeremy, trying to build a life while her husband was frequently deployed at sea. By April 1994, she was 4 months pregnant. Jeremy's younger brother Chad had recently arrived from Wisconsin. He was 19, waiting for his own fiancée to join him. He was sleeping on the living room sofa temporarily. On the night of April 16th, Jeremy was on duty aboard his ship. Chad returned to the apartment around 12:30 in the morning. He'd been drinking. He fell asleep on the couch. Tina was alone in the bedroom. And sometime in the hours that followed, someone entered that apartment. Someone who knew the family. Someone who knew Jeremy's schedule. Someone who knew exactly when Tina would be alone. Chad Heins had a documented sleep disorder. When he drank, he was especially difficult to wake. But at 5:45 that morning, the smoke alarm cut through his sleep like a knife. He jolted awake to a haze of smoke in the living room. Small flames were burning on the sofa beneath him. He jumped up, heart racing, and quickly extinguished the fire. There was another fire in the kitchen. He put that one out too. He disabled the screaming smoke alarm and stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then he thought of Tina. He walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. The door was open. What he saw next would haunt him for the rest of his life. Tina was lying in her bed, covered in blood, stabbed. Again and again and again. 27 times. Her hands bore defensive wounds. She had fought. She had tried. Chad stood frozen in the doorway for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then he ran for the phone and dialed 911. When Jacksonville Sheriff's Office officers arrived at the scene, they found a young woman brutally murdered. They found evidence of arson, 3 separate fires set throughout the apartment. They found a brother-in-law who had discovered the body, and they found something else. In the bathroom, the sink was stained with blood. Someone had tried to clean up. On the faucet, investigators lifted a fingerprint. It didn't belong to Tina. It didn't belong to Jeremy. It didn't belong to Chad. It belonged to someone else entirely. But that detail, critical, exculpatory, undeniable, would be hidden from view for more than a decade. Because investigators had already made up their minds. Chad Heins was their suspect, and nothing was going to change that. The theory was simple. Chad Heins had been staying in the apartment with his sister-in-law while his brother was at sea. Prosecutors believed he had made sexual advances toward Tina. When she rejected him, they said, he killed her in a jealous rage. Then he set fires to cover his tracks and pretended to discover the body. It was a compelling narrative, but it had one problem. It wasn't true. The evidence collected at the scene told a different story entirely. During the autopsy, forensic technicians scraped beneath Tina's fingernails. She had fought her attacker. Skin cells were there. DNA. A biological fingerprint left behind in her desperate struggle to survive. 3 hairs were also collected from her bedroom. And there was a semen stain on the bedsheets. Each of these pieces of evidence would be tested. And each of them pointed to the same conclusion. An unknown male had been in that bedroom. An unknown male had attacked Tina Heins. But prosecutors had tunnel vision. They wanted Chad. At trial in December 1996, the case against him rested almost entirely on the testimony of two jailhouse informants. These men claimed Chad had confessed to them while in custody. They said he told them he killed his brother's old lady. The prosecution insisted the informants had received no deals, no compensation, no incentive to lie. But they were lying anyway. A forensic analyst testified about the 3 hairs found in Tina's bedroom. She said the DNA came from someone other than Chad or Jeremy Heins. But she failed to provide statistical probability. She failed to explain what that really meant, and the jury didn't understand the significance. The defense had no idea about the fingerprint on the bathroom faucet, because prosecutors never told them. On December 20th, 1996, Chad Heins was convicted of first-degree murder and attempted sexual battery. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was 22 years old. He had just lost his entire future for a crime he didn't commit. But here's the first contradiction. Chad's story was that he had been asleep on the sofa when the crime occurred. He claimed he had no knowledge of what happened until the smoke alarm woke him. Prosecutors argued this was impossible. They said he must have been awake, must have committed the murder, must have set the fires himself. But investigators found no blood on Chad's clothing. None. Not a single drop. Tina had been stabbed 27 times. The bedroom was soaked in blood. If Chad had committed this crime, his clothes would have been drenched. Yet forensic tests found nothing. Here's the second contradiction. Prosecutors claimed Chad had attacked Tina in a violent rage. They said she had fought back against him. But when police examined Chad's body, they found no scratches, no scrapes, no marks of any kind. Tina had DNA under her fingernails from her attacker. She had clawed at someone. That someone wasn't Chad Heins. And here's the third contradiction. The jailhouse informants claimed Chad had confessed in detail, but their stories didn't match the evidence. They couldn't explain the unknown DNA. They couldn't explain the fingerprint. They couldn't explain how Chad could have committed a murder without leaving a single trace of blood or injury on himself. The testimony was built on lies, and the system accepted it anyway. For years, Chad sat in a prison cell, writing letters, filing motions, insisting on his innocence. In 2001, the Innocence Project received one of those letters. They took his case. In 2003, attorney Robert Beckham filed a motion for DNA testing on the skin cells found under Tina's fingernails. The results came back clear. The DNA belonged to an unknown male, not Chad Heins, not Jeremy Heins, someone else. In 2005, DNA from the 3 hairs was compared to the DNA from the fingernails. They matched. Both came from the same unknown person. In 2006, Chad's conviction was vacated. A new trial was ordered, but he wasn't released. He remained in custody, waiting. And during preparations for the retrial, his attorneys made a shocking discovery. They found documentation of the fingerprint on the blood-stained bathroom faucet, the fingerprint that didn't match Chad, didn't match Jeremy, didn't match Tina. The fingerprint that had been in police files before the original trial, the fingerprint that prosecutors had never disclosed to the defense. This was a Brady violation. Exculpatory evidence hidden from view that could have prevented the conviction entirely. In November 2007, one final DNA test was conducted. The semen stain on Tina's bedsheets. The results confirmed what was now undeniable. The semen came from the same unknown male as the hairs in their fingernail DNA. 3 independent sources, all pointing to one person, an unknown perpetrator who had never been caught. On December 4th, 2007, prosecutors dropped all charges against Chad Heins. He walked out of custody after 11 years in prison. He was 33 years old. He had lost his 20s. He had lost his freedom. He had lost 13 years of his life to a crime he did commit. But Tina's real killer was still out there. And for the next 18 years, that's where he would stay. Out there. Free. Unknown. The DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. Investigators ran searches weekly. No match. The perpetrator had no criminal record. He wasn't in the system. Detectives conducted hundreds of interviews. They collected DNA from potential suspects. Dead ends. All of them. The case went cold. In 2018, something changed. The Golden State Killer was arrested in California using a new technique called forensic genetic genealogy. Investigators had used DNA from crime scenes and compared it to genealogy databases. Not looking for the killer himself, but for his relatives. It was a breakthrough that would change criminal investigations forever. In Florida, the Department of Law Enforcement took notice. They recommended that the Heins case be submitted for advanced DNA testing. In 2017, State Attorney Melissa Nelson had made it a priority. She said their goal was clear: identify the man whose DNA was under Tina's nails, on her body, in her sheets. In 2021, forensic evidence from the case was sent to Othram Labs in Texas. Othram specialized in degraded DNA samples. They used a process called forensic-grade genome sequencing. Instead of the traditional STR markers used in CODIS, they analyzed hundreds of thousands of SNP markers. This created a far more detailed genetic profile. Othram's genealogy team then searched public genealogy databases. They weren't looking for Michael Ziegler. They were looking for his relatives, and they found them. Investigators followed the leads. They built a family tree. They identified a suspect: Michael Shane Ziegler, 52 years old, a retired merchant marine, living in Covington, Georgia, with his mother, more than 300 miles from Jacksonville. He had been a Navy sailor in 1994. He had served aboard the USS Leyte Gulf, the same ship as Jeremy Heins. They had been close friends, and Michael Ziegler had stood as a witness at Jeremy and Tina's wedding. Just 5 months before the murder, investigators obtained a DNA sample from one of Ziegler's relatives. They compared it to the crime scene profile. It was a match. After 31 years, Tina Heins' killer had finally been identified. On August 28, 2025, a grand jury indicted Michael Shane Ziegler for first-degree murder and sexual battery. On September 4th, a multi-agency task force arrested him in Georgia. He didn't run. He didn't resist. He had been living under the radar for 3 decades, but his biological footprint had endured. On September 18th, Ziegler was extradited to Jacksonville. On September 25th, the National Day of Remembrance for Homicide Victims, State Attorney Melissa Nelson announced the arrest. She stood before cameras and said what Tina's family had waited 31 years to hear. Justice was finally coming. Ziegler is currently held without bail, awaiting trial. The man who had been trusted. The man who had been welcomed into the family. The man who stood at their wedding. He had betrayed them in the most unthinkable way. For Chad Heins, the arrest brought a complicated kind of closure. He had been exonerated in 2007, but the real killer had remained unknown. Now, finally, the world knew the truth. Chad hadn't just been wrongfully convicted. He had been imprisoned while the actual murderer, someone his family knew, someone his brother had called a friend, walked free. For Tina's family in Wisconsin, the arrest came after more than 3 decades of grief. They had established a scholarship in her name. They had never stopped remembering. They had never stopped hoping for answers. And now, 31 years later, they had them. This case is a story of failure and redemption. It's a story of how the justice system can destroy an innocent man's life based on lies. And it's a story of how science, persistence, and the refusal to give up can eventually set things right. Tina Heins was 20 years old. She was 4 months pregnant. She had her whole life ahead of her, and it was taken by someone she should have been able to trust. But her DNA, left behind in a moment of desperate struggle, became the voice she no longer had. It freed an innocent man, and 31 years later, it finally named her killer. What do you think about the use of forensic genetic genealogy in solving cold cases like this. Do you believe justice delayed is still justice? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into cases that change the way we understand justice. Thank you for watching.